The vessel was not a spear of war nor a jagged needle of industry, but a gentle, rounded expanse of silvered composite that seemed to drink the light of the distant trinary stars. Within the central observation deck of the ship, known as the Amicable Horizon, a woman named Aris stood with her hands clasped behind her back, watching the nebula ahead churn with the colors of a bruised peach. She did not look like a conqueror, and she certainly did not carry the bearing of someone who expected to be feared. Her uniform was a simple charcoal fabric, devoid of medals or insignias of rank, reflecting a culture that had long ago decided that the most important people in the room were the ones who listened the most. Beside her, a tall, spindly being with skin like polished obsidian and 4 eyes that moved in independent pairs shifted its weight. This was Sovan, a representative of the first species humanity had encountered upon leaving their own solar system. They had been traveling together for 3 months, heading toward a sector of space that had remained a void on every star chart for 1,000 years. The mission was simple in theory and terrifying in practice: to make contact with the remnant cultures of the Great Silence. Aris leaned closer to the transparent shielding, her breath not even fogging the advanced material. She wondered what it must have been like for those who lived in this sector, cut off by the vast gravitational distortions of the surrounding black holes. To them, the rest of the galaxy was a myth, a collection of ghost stories told to children to explain the twinkling lights that never grew closer. Humanity had spent centuries looking up at the stars with a desperate, aching loneliness, and now that they had found friends like Sovan, their first instinct was to go back for those who were still waiting in the dark. It was a peculiar trait of the human spirit, Sovan had often remarked, this refusal to let anyone remain isolated. Most species, once they achieved faster-than-light travel, became inward-turning, perfecting their own paradises. Humans, however, seemed to view the universe as a house with too many locked doors and felt an obsessive need to find the keys for all of them. Aris smiled at the thought, a small, private movement of her lips that spoke of a deep-seated pride in her heritage. They were not the smartest or the strongest, but they were the most persistent neighbors the galaxy had ever seen. The ship groaned softly as the gravitational stabilizers compensated for the shifting tides of the nebula. It was a friendly sound, a reminder of the engineering marvels that kept them safe in the crushing vacuum. Aris turned to Sovan and spoke in a voice that was calm and resonant, carrying the weight of her conviction. She told him that she believed they would find something beautiful on the other side of the distortion, not a graveyard of fallen empires, but a garden that had grown in the shade. Sovan blinked his 4 eyes in a slow, rhythmic sequence that indicated thoughtful agreement. He had seen the way humans approached the unknown, always with a hand outstretched rather than a weapon drawn. It was a refreshing change from the histories of his own people, who had spent their early interstellar years building fortresses. The humans didn't build fortresses, they built bridges, and they built them with a structural integrity that defied the cynical expectations of older civilizations. As the Amicable Horizon plunged into the heart of the peach-colored gas, the sensors began to chime with a melodic frequency, signaling the detection of artificial structures. These were not the cold, metallic husks of derelict stations. Instead, they were vibrant, pulsing habitats that looked like giant, bioluminescent jellyfish drifting in the currents of the nebula. They were beautiful, organic, and clearly thriving. Aris felt a surge of warmth in her chest, a physical manifestation of the hope that had driven this entire expedition. They had found them. The inhabitants of the sector, the ones the rest of the galaxy had forgotten, were not just surviving, they were flourishing in a way that defied the standard models of planetary development. As the ship drew closer, the communication arrays began to flood with data, not in the form of aggressive pings or encrypted warnings, but as a vast, complex tapestry of greeting. It was a mathematics of welcome, a series of prime numbers and geometric constants that served as a universal bridge for intelligence. Aris felt a tear prick at the corner of her eye, though she did not let it fall. This was the moment that justified every long year of training and every lonely night spent staring at the telemetry of a distant, silent star. The bridge of the ship became a hive of quiet, purposeful activity. There were no shouts of alarm, only the rhythmic tapping of fingers on glass interfaces and the soft murmur of translations being verified. Aris moved among her crew, offering a steadying hand on a shoulder or a nod of encouragement. They were a diverse group, representing a dozen different terrestrial heritages, yet they moved with a single will. This was the human advantage, the ability to harmonize without losing individuality. They were a choir of different voices, singing the same melody of discovery. Outside, the jellyfish habitats began to pulse in synchronicity with the amicable horizon's own external lighting, a visual handshake across the void. The tension that had held the bridge in a tight grip for the last hour began to dissolve, replaced by a profound sense of awe. They were looking at a civilization that had never known the wars or the prejudices of the wider galaxy, a society that had grown in a vacuum of influence and had somehow chosen beauty as its primary directive. Sovan watched Aris as she took her seat in the center of the bridge, her eyes fixed on the main view screen. He saw in her the best of her kind, a mixture of relentless curiosity and a bone-deep empathy that extended even to those she had never met. It was a quality that many of the older races found baffling, even dangerous. They called it human recklessness, the tendency to jump into the fire just to see if someone else was burning. But Sovan saw it for what it truly was, an evolutionary leap in social consciousness. Humans didn't just want to exist, they wanted everyone to exist together. As the first docking sequence initiated, a delicate dance of magnetic tethers and pressurized seals, Aris took a deep breath. She knew that the next few hours would change the course of history for both the inhabitants of the nebula and the galaxy they had left behind. She was ready. They were all ready. The airlock cycled with a hiss of equalizing atmospheres, and the scent of jasmine and ozone filled the corridor, a strange but pleasant greeting from an alien world. Aris stepped forward, her boots making a soft, rhythmic sound on the deck plating. She was the first to reach the inner door, and as it slid open, she didn't see guards or heavy machinery. She saw a group of beings who looked like they were made of woven light and soft shadows, their forms shifting gracefully as they moved. They didn't have mouths to speak or eyes to see in the way humans did, but the air around them vibrated with a sense of profound peace. Aris didn't reach for a translator or a recording device. Instead, she simply opened her palms and lowered her head in a gesture of respect that was as old as her species. It was a sign that she came without tools of harm, that her hands were empty because her heart was full. One of the beings drifted forward, a soft glow emanating from its core, and touched its translucent limb to her forehead. In that moment, Aris felt a rush of images and emotions, the history of a people who had looked at the same dark sky and wondered the same things she had. They were not strangers, they were simply brothers and sisters who had been lost in a different room of the same house. The meeting continued for hours, a wordless exchange of concepts and histories that bridged the gap between two entirely different biological paths. The humans shared the story of their journey from the blue marble of Earth to the sprawling network of the modern galaxy, emphasizing the lessons they had learned about cooperation and the value of every life. The beings of the nebula, who called themselves the Weavers, shared the story of their own evolution within the protective embrace of the gas clouds, how they had learned to harness the energy of the gravitational tides to build their floating cities. There was no talk of trade agreements or territorial boundaries, only the shared joy of no longer being alone. Sovan stood back, watching the interaction with a sense of profound humility. He realized that he was witnessing something rare in the universe, a contact that was based entirely on the mutual desire for connection rather science or conquest. It was the human way, a path of radical kindness that was slowly but surely transforming every corner of the cosmos it touched. As the first cycle of their visit drew to a close, Aris returned to the amicable horizon to prepare for the formal delegations that would follow. Her mind was racing with the possibilities of what this discovery would mean. It wasn't just about new technology or resources. It was about the validation of the human belief that the universe was fundamentally a place of potential friendship. They had proven that even in the most isolated corners of space, life would find a way to be kind. She sat in her small cabin, looking at a digital photograph of her family back on Earth, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. She was a small part of a very large story, a story that was still being written by every hand that reached out in the dark. The amicable horizon sat anchored to the jellyfish habitat, a silver spark against the glowing peach of the nebula, a testament to the fact that no distance was too great and no void was too deep to keep the family of the stars apart. The next few days were a blur of activity, as scientists and diplomats from the amicable horizon worked alongside the Weavers to establish a permanent link between their two cultures. They discovered that the Weavers had a profound understanding of gravitational mechanics that surpassed anything the human-led coalition had yet achieved. In exchange, the humans offered their expertise in terraforming and atmospheric stabilization, skills honed over centuries of making hostile worlds feel like home. It was a perfect synergy, a blending of two different ways of looking at the physical laws of the universe. Aris watched as a human engineer and a weaver worked together on a piece of machinery, their movements synchronized despite their vastly different forms. It was a beautiful sight, a reminder that the barriers between species were often just failures of imagination. If you looked hard enough, you could always find a common language, even if it was just the language of making something work. Sovan approached Aris as she was overseeing the transfer of a cultural archive. He looked impressed, his four eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and admiration. He admitted that he had initially doubted the wisdom of this mission, fearing that they would find a hostile force or a dying world. He hadn't expected to find a partner that could teach even the oldest races something new. Aris smiled, her eyes bright with the reflected light of the nebula. She told him that the secret to the human success was not in their brilliance, but in their stubborn refusal to accept that things had to be difficult. They assumed everyone wanted to be friends until proven otherwise, and more often than not, that assumption became a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was a simple philosophy, but it had carried them across the light years and into the hearts of 1,000 different worlds. The amicable horizon was just one ship, but it carried the weight of a species that had decided that the dark was nothing to be afraid of as long as you brought enough lanterns. As the suns of the trinary system began to align, casting long, golden shadows across the docking bay, Aris felt a sense of completion. This was just the beginning, of course, but it was a beginning that felt solid and right. They would leave behind a small team to continue the work, and the amicable horizon would begin the journey back to the core worlds to share the news. The galaxy was about to get a little bit smaller and a whole lot brighter. Aris walked to the viewing port one last time before the ship departed, looking out at the glowing habitats of the Weavers. She whispered a quiet promise to the stars that they would be back, and that they would bring more lanterns. The human journey was far from over, but in this small corner of the universe, they had found a light that would never go out. It was the light of a friendship born in the most unlikely of places, nurtured by the simple human desire to say hello and mean it. The engines of the amicable horizon hummed to life, a low, comforting vibration that signaled the start of the return trip. The ship slowly detached from the Weaver habitat, the magnetic tethers releasing with a soft metallic click. As they pulled away, the bioluminescent structures of the nebula pulsed in a final, grand display of farewell, a light show that spanned hundreds of kilometers. Aris sat in her chair on the bridge, her heart full and her mind at peace. She knew that the path ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but she also knew that they were no longer walking it alone. The great silence had been broken, replaced by a chorus of voices that would only grow louder as more doors were unlocked. Humanity had found its way into the heart of the mystery and found that it was not a cold, empty place, but a home waiting for its family to return. With a final look at the peach-colored clouds, Aris gave the order to jump, and the ship vanished into the slipstream, carrying the hope of 1,000 worlds back to the light. The transition from the velvet fold of the slipstream back into the familiar coordinates of the human-led coalition space was marked by a gentle chime, a sound specifically designed by acoustic engineers to soothe the nervous systems of dozen-plus biological species. Aris remained in the command chair of the amicable horizon, her gaze fixed on the primary telemetry displays as the star charts reconfigured themselves. They were now orbiting a massive hub station known as the Great Tangent, a sprawling lattice of bronze-hued metal and crystalline domes that served as the diplomatic gateway for 18 different civilizations. It was a testament to the era of cooperation that had defined the last 3 centuries, a period where the competitive drive of early humanity had been successfully redirected into the competitive pursuit of mutual prosperity. The station glowed with the light of a nearby yellow dwarf star, its rotating rings creating a sense of artificial gravity that anchored the thousands of residents within. Aris felt the familiar pull of the station's docking tractor beams, a steady and invisible hand guiding them home after their long excursion into the unknown. Beside her, Sovan was already busy preparing the initial data packets for the High Council. His obsidian skin shimmered under the bridge lights, reflecting the scrolling lines of green and gold text that represented the Weaver archives. He paused for a moment, his upper pair of eyes tracking a specific sequence of gravitational harmonics they had recorded within the peach-colored nebula. He remarked to Aris that the scientific community would likely spend decades simply attempting to categorize the fundamental physics the Weavers used to maintain their habitats. It wasn't just a different technology, it was a different philosophy of interaction with the material world. Humans tended to view the universe as a set of problems to be solved with tools, while the Weavers seemed to view it as a conversation to be joined. Aris nodded, appreciating the distinction. She told Sovan that the most important thing they were bringing back wasn't the data on gravity, but the proof that a civilization could thrive for a millennium in total isolation without losing its capacity for kindness. As the airlock hissed open and the umbilical connected the ship to the station, Aris was met not by a military escort, but by a small group of botanists and linguists. This was the protocol of the modern era. The first people to greet a returning expedition were always the ones best equipped to nurture the new knowledge being brought back. A man named Soren, a senior researcher with a penchant for wearing colorful woven vests from the colonies of Proxima, stepped forward with a wide grin. He didn't ask about tactical threats or resources. He asked if the air in the nebula smelled as sweet as the preliminary sensors had suggested. Aris laughed, the sound echoing through the sterile white corridor of the docking bay. She told him it smelled like jasmine and ozone, a combination that shouldn't work, but somehow felt like the scent of a summer storm on old Earth. Soren clapped his hands in delight, his eyes already searching the cargo crates for the samples of bioluminescent flora the weavers had gifted them. The debriefing took place in a room that overlooked the primary garden of the Great Tangent. It was a massive arboretum filled with trees from 6 different planets, their branches interlaced to form a canopy of emerald, violet, and silver leaves. Aris sat at a circular table made of recycled hull plating, surrounded by representatives who looked nothing like her but shared her quiet intensity. There was an aquatic being suspended in a hovering sphere of oxygenated water, a crystalline entity that vibrated at a frequency just below human hearing, and several other humans who had spent their entire lives in deep space. They listened in rapt silence as Aris recounted the meeting with the weavers. She spoke of the wordless exchange of history and the way the weavers had touched her forehead to share their collective memory. She described the jellyfish habitats not as machines, but as living extensions of the nebula itself. When she finished, the room remained quiet for a long minute, a collective moment of reflection that was more respectful than any round of applause. The aquatic representative, whose name was a series of rhythmic clicks translated as Thol, pulsed a soft blue light within its sphere. Through the translator, Thol expressed a profound sense of relief. For many of the non-human species in the coalition, there had always been a lingering fear that the great silence of the outer sectors was a warning, a sign that civilizations eventually reached a point of collapse or inherent hostility. To hear that the weavers had remained peaceful and creative in their solitude was a validation of the coalition's own founding principles. Aris leaned forward, her voice steady and filled with a quiet power. She told the council that humanity had always believed the universe was a crowded place, even when they had no proof. They had spent their early history shouting into the void, hoping for an echo, and now that they were finally hearing the voices of others, it was their responsibility to ensure the conversation never stopped. They weren't just explorers, they were the stewards of a growing harmony. Over the next several weeks, the atmosphere on the Great Tangent shifted from one of academic curiosity to a vibrant, bustling energy. The news of the Weaver contact had spread through the FTL communications relay, touching every colony and outpost in the known sectors. It wasn't just a scientific breakthrough, it was a cultural phenomenon. Artists began creating sculptures inspired by the organic curves of the Weaver habitats, and musicians attempted to replicate the gravitational harmonics in their compositions. Aris found herself at the center of this whirlwind, though she preferred the quiet of the station's laboratories. She spent much of her time with Soren, helping him understand the environmental conditions of the Peach Nebula so he could recreate them in the station's experimental biodomes. They weren't just trying to grow alien plants, they were trying to build a space where Weaver diplomats could eventually feel at home. It was the human way of hospitality, preparatory, proactive, and deeply personal. One evening, Aris stood on the outer observation rim of the station, watching a transport ship depart for the core worlds. Soven joined her, his movements silent on the padded flooring. He asked her if she ever felt overwhelmed by the scale of what they had started. Aris looked out at the stars, which seemed more vibrant than ever. She told him that she felt a sense of immense weight, but it wasn't a burden. It was the weight of a foundation being laid. Every species they brought into the fold, every bridge they built, made the entire structure of their civilization more stable. Humans had a history of building things that fell down, empires, skyscrapers, social systems, but they had finally learned that the only way to build something that lasted was to make everyone a part of the construction. Sovereign considered this, his four eyes reflecting the distant glow of the transport ship's engines. He remarked that humans were perhaps the only race that viewed their own past failures as a manual for future success. The work on the biodome was nearing completion when a message arrived from the Amicable Horizon's sister ship, the Cordial Venture. They had been sent to establish a relay station on the edge of the Peach Nebula and reported that the Weavers had begun to build a structure of their own to meet them halfway. It was a massive spire of light and woven gas, designed to act as a permanent gateway between the two sectors. The Weavers were not just waiting to be visited, they were actively reaching back. This news sent a wave of excitement through the station. It was the ultimate confirmation of a successful first contact. The relationship was no longer one of a discoverer and a discovered. It was a partnership of equals. Aris felt a profound sense of satisfaction. She knew that the spire would one day be a bustling port, a place where children from a dozen worlds would look up at a sky that no longer felt empty or frightening. As the formal delegation prepared to depart for the newly named Weaver Gateway, Aris was asked to lead the group. It was an honor she hadn't sought, but felt a duty to accept. She spent her final night on the Great Tangent walking through the central garden, listening to the rustle of the multicolored leaves and the soft hum of the station's life support systems. She thought about the generations of humans who had come before her, those who had dreamed of this moment while standing on the soil of a single, fragile planet. They had overcome their own divisions and their own fears to reach a point where they could stand as the welcoming committee for the rest of the galaxy. It was a miracle of will and empathy. She paused by a small pond where Thol was resting, the aquatic being moving slowly in the dim light. They exchanged a brief, silent greeting, a simple acknowledgement of their shared journey. The departure was a grand affair, though it lacked the pomp and circumstance of ancient military parades. Instead, it was a celebration of diversity. Thousands of residents gathered in the docking bays to watch the delegation board a fleet of silver ships. There were no flags of conquest, only banners that displayed the geometric constants of the universal language. Aris stood at the airlock of the Amicable Horizon, looking out at the crowd. She saw faces of all shapes and colors, eyes of different numbers and positions, all turned toward the ships with a shared expression of hope. She realized then that the humanity fuck yeah sentiment wasn't about being the best. It was about the sheer, stubborn joy of being together. It was the triumph of the social animal over the cold vacuum of the universe. She stepped inside, the door closing with a solid, reassuring thud, and felt the ship begin to vibrate as the engines prepared for the jump. The journey back to the nebula felt shorter this time, perhaps because the destination was now a known and welcomed place. When they emerged from the slipstream, the peach-colored clouds were waiting, glowing with an inner light that seemed even more brilliant than before. And there, rising from the edge of the distortion, was the Weaver Spire. It was a breathtaking structure, a vertical ribbon of shimmering energy and translucent material that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It was a monument to the first conversation between two worlds. As the Amicable Horizon approached, Aris could see the Weaver habitats pulsing in a complex rhythm of greeting. They were no longer just observers, they were participants in a new era. The bridge of the ship was filled with the sound of data being synchronized and translations being fine-tuned, a harmonious noise that represented the best of what they could achieve together. Aris took her seat and gave the order to initiate docking. She looked at the view screen where the spire loomed large and beautiful. She knew that this was the first of many such structures, a network of light that would eventually span the entire galaxy. The great silence was over, and in its place was a symphony of voices, each one unique and each one necessary. Humanity had found its purpose not in being the masters of the stars, but in being the ones who made sure every star had someone to talk to. As the ship made contact with the spire, a soft, resonant vibration traveled through the hull, a physical manifestation of the connection they had forged. Aris closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the feeling. They were home, and home was now a much bigger place than they had ever imagined. The stellar conciliation had begun, and the future was looking brighter with every heartbeat. The interior of the Weaver Spire was a cathedral of suspended liquid and solidified light, a structural paradox that challenged every Terran architectural convention. Aris felt the subtle shift in the gravitational constants as she stepped onto the primary concourse, her boots sinking slightly into a floor that felt like pressurized silk. The air was thick with the scent of ionizing minerals and a faint, sweet musk that reminded her of the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, a sensory ghost of a home she had not seen in years. Beside her, Sovereign was meticulously calibrating a handheld atmospheric sampler, his four eyes widening as the readouts confirmed a breathable mixture that required no heavy filtration. It was a gesture of profound hospitality. The Weavers had adjusted the very chemistry of their environment to accommodate the biological needs of their guests. This was the human dream of first contact rendered in physical form, a space where the physics of the universe had been bent not for the sake of power, but for the sake of comfort. Aris watched as the first group of Weaver representatives descended from the upper tiers of the spire, their translucent bodies rippling with soft shades of indigo and gold. They moved with a fluid, buoyant grace, as if the air itself offered the resistance of water. One of the beings, whose internal glow was particularly vibrant, drifted toward her and stopped a respectful distance away. It reached out with a limb that seemed to shimmer into existence from the ambient light, offering a crystalline sphere that pulsed with a rhythmic, internal warmth. Aris took the gift with both hands, feeling a gentle vibration travel up her arms. It was not a recording or a piece of technology, but a localized harmonic of the nebula's natural resonance. It was a piece of their home, literally tuned to the frequency of her own heartbeat. She felt a surge of genuine affection for these beings, who communicated through the language of shared experience rather than the rigid structures of syntax. The delegation moved deeper into the spire, passing through chambers where the walls were made of trapped lightning and the ceilings displayed the real-time movement of the trinary stars. There were no signs of industry, no clatter of machinery, and no aggressive displays of technological superiority. Instead, everything felt grown, nurtured, and intentional. Sovereign remarked that the Weavers appeared to have bypassed the traditional stages of mechanical evolution, moving directly from biological manipulation to the mastery of fundamental forces. It was a humbling realization for the Coalition scientists who had spent centuries perfecting the art of the forge and the circuit. Aris noted that the Weavers seemed just as fascinated by the human tools. A young Weaver hovered near a human engineer's diagnostic tablet, its colors shifting to a curious orange as it observed the flickering pixels and the logic of the interface. It was a beautiful, symmetrical exchange of wonder. The primary assembly hall was a vast, open bowl that looked out into the heart of the peach-colored nebula. The swirling gases outside provided a backdrop of constant, silent motion, a cosmic ballet that underscored the importance of the meeting. The representatives of the 18 coalition worlds took their places on elevated platforms that had been grown from the floor of the spire, their diverse forms creating a mosaic of life against the silvered composite. Aris stood at the center, her charcoal uniform a stark contrast to the brilliant colors of the room. She was not there to speak for humanity alone, but to act as the focal point for the collective hope of 100 different solar systems. The weavers gathered in a shimmering cloud above them, their collective glow brightening until the entire hall was filled with a warm, golden light that seemed to erase the shadows between the participants. The conversation began not with a speech, but with a shared sensory immersion. The weavers projected a massive, three-dimensional map of the sector into the center of the hall, showing the gravitational webs they used to navigate the distortion. It was a complex, beautiful lattice that resembled the neural pathways of a giant brain. They showed how they had survived the isolation, how they had harvested the energy of the black holes to create life-sustaining warmth, and how they had watched the distant stars with a longing that mirrored the human experience. Aris felt the collective emotion of the room shift from curiosity to a profound sense of kinship. They were seeing a mirror of their own history, a story of resilience and the refusal to let the dark be the final word. When the projection faded, Aris stepped forward, her voice amplified by the spire's own resonant properties. She spoke of the humanity fuck yeah philosophy, though she used different words to convey the sentiment to the diverse audience. She described it as the great persistence, the stubborn human belief that the universe was a place of potential harmony. She explained how humanity had once been a fractious, divided species that had nearly destroyed itself, only to find salvation in the realization that they were stronger when they were together. She told the weavers that the coalition was not an empire of territory, but an empire of ideas, a collective effort to ensure that no civilization ever had to face the silence of the void alone. The weavers responded with a synchronized pulse of light that translated as a deep, resonant yes. It was a confirmation that the values humanity had brought to the stars were not just local preferences, but universal truths that resonated even in the most isolated corners of the galaxy. As the formal session concluded, the spire became a site of informal celebration. Humans, Sovan's kin, and the aquatic thol mingled with the weavers, using a combination of translation devices and simple gestures to share stories and ideas. Aris found herself sitting on a ledge of solidified light, watching a human pilot teach a weaver how to play a simplified game of strategy using small, glowing pebbles. There was no competition in the interaction, only the joy of learning a new way to think. Soren, the botanist, was in a nearby corner, engaged in a heated but friendly debate with a weaver about the best way to encourage the growth of bioluminescent moss. It was a scene of utter normalcy in an environment that was fundamentally alien, a testament to the human ability to make any place feel like a community. Sovan approached Aris, his four eyes reflecting the golden light of the hall. He looked more relaxed than she had ever seen him. He admitted that he had been prepared for a clash of ideologies, a struggle to reconcile the mechanical nature of the coalition with the organic nature of the weavers, but instead he saw a convergence. The humans had acted as the catalyst, their inherent flexibility and desire for connection bridging the gap between two radically different paths of evolution. He remarked that humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy wasn't their technology or their art, but their ability to act as the connective tissue of the universe. They were the ones who saw the patterns in the chaos and insisted that those patterns meant something. Aris smiled, looking out at the Peach Nebula. She told him that humans were simply the ones who couldn't stand a quiet room. The next few days were spent formalizing the Weaver Accords, a document that outlined the framework for ongoing cooperation and exchange. It was not a legalistic or bureaucratic text, but a series of guiding principles based on mutual respect and the preservation of diversity. The Accords established the Weaver Gateway as a permanent neutral zone, a place where any species could come to learn the arts of gravitational mechanics and organic synthesis. It also included a commitment from the Coalition to assist the Weavers in expanding their habitats beyond the nebula, allowing them to finally explore the galaxy they had watched for so long. Aris signed the document on behalf of the Coalition, her hand steady and her heart full. It was a moment of profound historical significance, the closing of a chapter of isolation and the beginning of a chapter of integration. As the departure date for the Amicable Horizon approached, Aris felt a strange sense of reluctance to leave. She had grown fond of the spire, with its shifting lights and its scent of jasmine and ozone. She had formed a genuine bond with the Weaver who had given her the crystalline sphere, an entity she had come to think of as a mentor in the art of wordless communication. They spent their final hours together on the observation rim, watching the trinary stars begin their slow descent toward the horizon of the nebula. The Weaver shared a final image with her, a vision of a future where the entire galaxy was linked by spires like this one, a web of light that would ensure the great silence never returned. It was a vision of a universe that was no longer a vast, empty space, but a vibrant, interconnected home. The journey back to the docking bay of the Amicable Horizon was a quiet one. The crew moved with a sense of purposeful calm, their spirits lifted by the success of the mission. Aris stood at the airlock one last time, looking back at the Weaver who had become her friend. There were no words spoken, but none were needed. The connection was solid and real, a bridge that would remain long after the ship had vanished into the slipstream. She stepped inside, the door sliding shut with a familiar, comforting hiss. The bridge of the ship was buzzing with activity as the final preparations for the jump were made. Sovan was at his station, his 4 eyes tracking the departure coordinates with professional precision. He looked up at Aris and gave a slow, rhythmic blink of his eyes, a gesture of deep respect and shared triumph. As the Amicable Horizon pulled away from the spire, the entire structure began to pulse in a grand, final display of farewell. The bioluminescent light rippled up and down the ribbon of energy, creating a visual symphony that could be seen for thousands of kilometers. Aris sat in her command chair, her gaze fixed on the view screen. She knew that the news of the Weaver Accords would change everything. The Coalition would grow, new technologies would emerge, and the very nature of interstellar society would evolve. But at the core of it all would be the simple human belief that reached out across the dark and found a hand to hold. The stellar conciliation was more than just a treaty. It was a promise that the family of the stars would always look out for its own. With a final, lingering look at the peach-colored clouds, Aris gave the order to jump, and the ship surged forward into the velvet embrace of the slipstream, carrying the light of a new friendship back to the waiting worlds. The return to the core sectors was not merely a physical journey, but a transition into a new state of being for the entire human-led coalition. As the Amicable Horizon glided toward the central docking spires of the capital world, a planet named Oakhaven for its sprawling, engineered forests, Aris noticed that the very atmosphere of the comm-chatter had changed. It was no longer a series of isolated reports and logistical demands. It had become a vibrant, multi-tonal polyphony. The data packets from the Weaver Spire had already begun to circulate, and the intellectual landscape of 100 worlds was shifting overnight. Engineers were debating the ethics of organic architecture, and philosophers were re-evaluating the definition of presence in a universe where light and thought could be so seamlessly entwined. Aris sat in her cabin, the small crystalline sphere from the Weaver Mentor resting on her desk. It pulsed with a soft, amber light, a rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with the vibration of the ship's sublight engines. It was a grounding force, a reminder that among the high-level politics and scientific breakthroughs, the core of their mission was a singular, tactile friendship. Sovan entered the cabin without a chime, his movements fluid and hurried. His upper eyes were fixed on a holographic projection of a weaver habitat, while his lower eyes scanned a series of structural integrity reports from Oakhaven's primary research facility. He explained to Aris that the scientists on the surface were already attempting to replicate the solidified light structures, but they were running into a fundamental barrier. They were trying to build the light using lasers and magnetic fields, treating it like a construction project. The weavers, however, didn't build the light, they invited it to stay. It was a conceptual gap that humanity was struggling to leap across. Aris stood up, her hand brushing the cool surface of the crystal. She suggested to Sovan that perhaps the problem wasn't the technology, but the intent. Humans were used to forcing the universe to obey, but the weavers worked through a process of mutual resonance. To build like a weaver, one had to think like a weaver, prioritizing the harmony of the environment over the utility of the structure. The descent into Oakhaven was a spectacular display of the Coalition's aesthetic. The planet was a masterpiece of ecological restoration, where the jagged scars of early industrialization had been healed by centuries of dedicated terraforming. Massive orbital elevators rose like silver threads from the emerald canopy, connecting the surface to the bustling trade hubs above. Aris watched from the observation deck as they passed through the cloud layer, seeing the sprawling cities that were nestled within the giant trees rather than replacing them. This was the pinnacle of the human journey, a world where high technology and primal nature existed in a state of perfect, intentional balance. It was the physical manifestation of the humanity fuck yeah spirit, the refusal to accept that progress had to come at the cost of the soul. As the ship touched down on the landing pad, a soft hiss of equalizing pressure signaled their arrival. The welcoming committee was led by a woman named Ilara, a high-ranking coordinator who had spent her career advocating for the preservation of non-human cultural heritage. She didn't approach with a formal salute or a pre-written speech. Instead, she walked up to Aris and simply took her hands, her eyes bright with a mixture of relief and exhilaration. Ilara whispered that the news of the Weaver Accords had done more to unify the fringe colonies than a century of economic incentives ever could. The idea that there was still so much to discover and that the discovery was so fundamentally peaceful had reignited the collective imagination of the species. Aris felt a profound sense of accomplishment. She realized that the most important resource they had brought back wasn't the gravitational data or the organic synthesis techniques. It was the renewal of wonder. In a galaxy that was becoming increasingly mapped and managed, they had found a reminder that the unknown was still a place of beauty. The following days were a marathon of presentations and collaborative sessions. Aris found herself standing before a gathering of the brightest minds from a dozen different species, explaining the nuances of Weaver interaction. She didn't use technical jargon or strategic analysis. She spoke about the scent of jasmine, the feeling of the pressurized silk floors, and the way the weavers' colors shifted when they were curious. She wanted them to understand that the weavers were not just a new variable in the galactic equation, but a new way of solving the equation itself. Beside her, Sovan presented the data on the Weaver Spire, showing how the structure interacted with the surrounding nebula to create a self-sustaining energy loop. The audience was mesmerized. For the first time in generations, the Coalition was looking at a technology that didn't just extract energy from the universe, but participated in its natural flow. One afternoon, Aris was invited to the Great Arboretum, a vast laboratory where Soren and a team of weaver specialists were working to integrate the first samples of the nebula flora. The room was filled with a soft, peach-colored mist that mimicked the conditions of the weaver sector. In the center of the room, a single bioluminescent plant was beginning to pulse in synchronicity with the facility's power grid. It wasn't just growing, it was communicating with the machinery. Soren was practically vibrating with excitement, explaining that the plant was acting as a natural regulator, smoothing out the fluctuations in the energy flow. He noted that if they could scale this up, they could create power grids that were entirely organic and self-healing. Aris watched as a small weaver drone, a translucent sphere sent as part of the exchange, hovered near the plant, its colors shifting in a rhythmic dance of encouragement. It was a small-scale version of the future they were building, a synthesis of the mechanical and the organic, the human and the alien. Sovan joined her in the arboretum, his obsidian skin glowing faintly in the peach mist. He remarked that he had seen many first contacts in his long life, but he had never seen one that felt so effortless. He attributed this to the human capacity for radical inclusion. Other races might have approached the weavers with caution, seeking to understand their defenses or their resource potential before engaging. Humans, however, had simply walked in and started a conversation. They assumed the best of the universe, and in doing so, they brought the best of the universe to the surface. Aris leaned against a railing made of living wood, watching the weaver drone. She told Sovan that humanity had spent so long being afraid of the dark that when they finally found a light, their first instinct was to share it. It wasn't a calculated strategy, it was a biological imperative. They were a social species that had finally found a social galaxy. The climax of the visit was the formal activation of the Oakhaven Relay, a terrestrial version of the Weaver Spire that had been constructed in the heart of the capital city. It was a shorter, sturdier version of the Ribbon of Light, designed to act as a permanent communication link with the Weaver sector. As the sun began to set behind the giant oaks, casting the city in shades of copper and violet, a massive crowd gathered to witness the event. There were no soldiers, no displays of power, only thousands of people holding small, glowing lanterns that echoed the Weaver aesthetic. Aris stood on the central dais, her hand on the activation sensor. She felt the weight of the moment, the connection between the past of her ancestors and the future of her children. With a soft, determined movement, she pressed the sensor, and a beam of pure, golden light shot upward, piercing the atmosphere and vanishing into the stars. A second later, the beam pulsed. It was the return signal from the Weaver Spire, thousands of light years away. The connection was established. The crowd erupted not into a roar of triumph, but into a sustained, harmonious hum, a sound that mimicked the resonance of the nebula. It was a moment of profound unity. Aris looked up at the beam of light, tears finally streaming down her face. They had done it. They had turned the great silence into a great conversation. The Oakhaven Relay was more than just a piece of technology. It was a beacon of hope, a physical link to a friend they had only just met but had always been looking for. The air around the relay began to glow with the familiar peach hue, and for a moment, the two worlds were one, joined by a thread of light that no distance could break. That evening, a quiet dinner was held in the Canopy Gardens for the delegation and the Weaver representatives. There were no formal toasts, only the shared joy of a meal prepared with ingredients from a dozen different worlds. Aris sat next to Sovan, watching as a group of human children played with a Weaver drone, their laughter ringing through the branches. She realized that this was the true legacy of their mission. It wasn't the treaties or the technology, it was the fact that these children would grow up in a universe where an alien was just a neighbor they hadn't visited yet. The humanity fuck yeah spirit had evolved from a cry of defiance into a song of welcome. They had proven that the greatest strength of their species was not their ability to conquer, but their ability to connect. As the twin moons of Oakhaven rose over the horizon, casting a silver glow over the forest, Aris walked to the edge of the garden. She looked out at the city, where the lights of the buildings and the lights of the trees were indistinguishable from the stars above. She felt a deep, abiding peace. The journey of the amicable horizon was far from over. There were still so many sectors to explore, so many voices yet to be heard, but the foundation was solid. They had built a bridge that would stand for 1,000 years, and they had built it with the simplest of tools: kindness, curiosity, and a refusal to be alone. She reached into her pocket and touched the crystalline sphere, feeling its steady, warm pulse. It was a reminder that even in the vastness of the cosmos, the most powerful force was the one that pulled two hearts together. Sovan joined her at the railing, his 4 eyes fixed on the distant glow of the Oakhaven relay. He didn't say anything, but the way he stood, his shoulders relaxed and his posture open, spoke volumes. They were partners in a grand adventure, two different species united by a single vision of a better universe. Aris looked at him and smiled, a gesture of friendship that required no translation. She knew that the path ahead would be filled with challenges, but she also knew that they would face them together. The stellar conciliation was not a destination, but a journey, and they were just getting started. With a final look at the stars, she turned back to the warmth of the garden, ready for whatever the next chapter would bring. The light of the Weaver Spire was still burning in her mind, a promise that the dark would never be absolute again. The transition from the architectural wonders of Oakhaven to the deep space research vessel, the resonant chord, felt like moving from a lush garden into a precisely calibrated laboratory of light. Aris stood in the specialized hangar bay, watching as a team of Weaver architects worked alongside human structural engineers to assemble the first mobile diplomatic relay. This was not a ship in the traditional sense. It was a living lattice of solidified photons and carbon nanotube webbing, designed to drift between sectors as a neutral ground for the entire coalition. The air in the hangar hummed with a frequency that vibrated in the marrow of her bones, a low-frequency song of construction that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the physical form. Beside her, Sovan was monitoring the energy output of the Weaver-human hybrid core. His obsidian skin was mapped with patterns of golden light reflecting from the shimmering hull, and his 4 eyes were fixed on the delicate interplay of magnetic bottles and gravitational anchors. He remarked that the humans were no longer just building tools, they were building ecosystems that happened to travel through the void. The project was the centerpiece of the newfound alliance, a physical manifestation of the Weaver Accords. It was intended to be the first of many peace anchors, stations that would sit at the borders of unexplored space, broadcasting a signal of welcome rather than a warning of territory. Aris walked along the perimeter of the assembly, her hand trailing along a section of the hull that felt like cool, polished glass, but yielded slightly to the touch, like organic tissue. She saw a group of human apprentices, their faces smudged with the metallic dust of the shipyard, laughing as they traded lunch rations with a Weaver drone that responded by pulsing a soft, appreciative lavender. There was no hierarchy here, no rigid military discipline, only the messy, vibrant energy of a species that had finally found a way to work without ego. It was the human way at its most refined, the ability to turn a monumental task into a communal celebration. The chief engineer, a woman named Marin who had spent 40 years building the massive jump gates of the inner rim, approached Aris with a look of profound exhaustion and even deeper joy. She didn't offer a report on structural stress or fuel efficiency. Instead, she pointed toward the central spire of the new vessel, where a weaver was currently weaving a strand of pure light into the navigation array. Marin whispered that she had spent her life trying to make metal survive the vacuum, but the weavers had taught her that the vacuum wasn't an enemy to be fought. It was a medium to be inhabited. They were learning to build with the universe instead of against it. Aris nodded, understanding the shift. Humanity had spent its infancy building walls against the cold, but they were now entering a maturity where they could simply turn up the warmth of their own internal light. The first test of the mobile relay, christened the Amicable Accord, was set for the following week. It was to jump to a sector known as the Veil of Tears, a region of space characterized by dense, dark nebulae and a history of failed early interstellar probes. For centuries, the Veil had been a source of superstition and fear, a place where the light of distant stars was swallowed by ancient dust. The mission was to place the Accord at the center of the Veil and begin broadcasting the universal greeting. It was a gamble of pure optimism. Aris was to command the mission, supported by Sovan and a hand-picked crew of diplomats and scientists. As she prepared for the departure, she spent hours in the ship's meditation chamber, a room where the walls were made of the same peach-colored gas as the Weaver sector. She sat in the silence, letting the rhythmic pulse of the Weaver crystal in her pocket steady her mind. She wasn't afraid of what they might find in the dark. She was only worried that they wouldn't bring enough light to fill it. The jump into the Veil of Tears was unlike any slipstream transition Aris had ever experienced. Usually, the jump was a moment of sensory deprivation, a grey void that lasted for a heartbeat. But with the Weaver hybrid core, the transition was a kaleidoscope of color and sound, a rush of sensory data that felt like being born. When the Amicable Accord finally emerged into real space, the bridge crew gasped in unison. The Veil was not the empty, oppressive darkness the old charts had suggested. Instead, the dense dust clouds were illuminated from within by millions of tiny, bioluminescent organisms that drifted in the stellar winds. It was a sea of stars within a sea of dust, a hidden garden that had been waiting for eyes to see it. Sovan's lower eyes tracked the movement of the organisms, his voice hushed as he noted that they were responding to the Accord's gravitational wake. They weren't just observing the life, they were part of its rhythm. The activation of the relay began with a low, resonant chime that echoed through the entire ship. The central spire of the Accord began to glow, a beam of pure gold cutting through the dark dust of the Veil. It wasn't a searchlight, it was a heartbeat. Every 3 seconds, the ship pulsed, sending a wave of mathematics and emotion out into the unknown. For the first 24 hours, there was no response. The crew sat in a state of heightened anticipation, monitoring the long-range sensors for any sign of artificial movement. Aris remained on the bridge, her gaze fixed on the viewscreen. She thought about the early human explorers who had sailed across the dark oceans of Earth, hoping to find land. They had carried the same hope, the same stubborn belief that the horizon held a friend rather than a monster. On the second day, a signal arrived. It wasn't a radio transmission or a digital packet. It was a ripple in the gravitational field, a rhythmic distortion that matched the Accord's own pulse. Something was answering. From the depths of the dust clouds, a series of massive, crystalline structures began to emerge. They were jagged and ancient, looking more like asteroids than ships, but they moved with a clear, intentional grace. These were the Liths, a species that had been hypothesized in ancient myths but never confirmed. They were beings of slow thought and deep memory, living for millennia within the protective embrace of the Veil. They had heard the human greeting and after a day of deliberation had decided to respond. The communication was slow, a heavy, tectonic language that felt like the grinding of mountains, but the intent was clear: curiosity. Aris stepped into the communication hub, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment that defined the humanity of her era, not the ability to fight the Liths, but the ability to wait for them. She signaled for the Weaver delegates to join her, knowing that their experience with nonlinear communication would be vital. Together, they began to weave a response. They didn't talk about trade or territory. They shared the story of the Weaver Spire, the Peach Nebula, and the green forests of Oakhaven. They shared the feeling of a sun on the skin and the sound of a child's laughter. The Liths responded with images of the slow birth of stars and the crushing peace of the deep nebula. It was a dialogue of scales, a bridge between the ephemeral lives of humans and the geological lives of the Liths. Sovan watched the exchange from a secondary console, his 4 eyes wet with a shimmering fluid. He whispered to Marin that he had spent his youth believing that the universe was a place of finite resources and inevitable conflict. But watching Aris, he realized that the only thing in the universe that was truly infinite was the capacity for understanding. The humans had brought this realization to the stars, not as a philosophy, but as a practice. They treated every new species as a long-lost relative, and in doing so, they forced the universe to be a family. The Liths began to move closer to the Accord, their crystalline hulls reflecting the golden light of the relay. They weren't just approaching a ship, they were joining a community. As the days turned into weeks, the Vale of Tears transformed from a place of mystery into a hub of activity. The Liths shared their knowledge of deep-time stellar evolution, providing the Coalition with data that would allow them to predict the movements of the galaxy for the next billion years. In exchange, the humans and Weavers offered the Liths a connection to the vibrant, fast-moving world of the inner sectors. A permanent embassy was established within the crystalline structures of the Liths, a place where time slowed down and the fast-paced lives of humans could find a moment of profound stillness. Aris spent several days among the Liths, learning the art of the deep listen, a meditative state that allowed her to perceive the slow, melodic vibrations of the stars. It was a gift of perspective that she knew would change the Coalition forever. When it was time for the amicable Accord to return to the core worlds, the departure was marked by a gravitational wave that shook the entire sector. It wasn't a destructive force, but a collective thank you from the Liths, a resonance that would linger in the Vale for centuries. Aris stood on the bridge of the Accord, watching the crystalline structures vanish back into the dust. She felt a sense of profound peace. They had taken one of the most feared places in the galaxy and turned it into a sanctuary. The humanity fuck yeah spirit had found its most potent expression not in a shout of triumph, but in a whisper of greeting that had reached across the eons. The journey back to Oakhaven was a celebration. Every station they passed, every colony they signaled, erupted in a chorus of light and data. The news of the Lith contact had solidified the Coalition's belief in its own mission. They were no longer just a collection of species trying to survive. They were a civilization that was actively making the universe a better place. Aris sat in her cabin, looking at the 2 crystals on her desk, the amber one from the Weavers and a new, clear one from the Liths that felt like a solid block of frozen time. They were the bookends of her journey, symbols of 2 radically different worlds that had found common ground in the human heart. She knew that there were still thousands of sectors to explore, thousands of voices waiting in the dark, but she was no longer worried about the scale of the task. They had the light, and they had each other. As the green and silver sphere of Oakhaven appeared on the view screen, Aris felt a surge of love for her home. It was a small world in a vast galaxy, but it was the place that had taught her that no door should ever stay locked. She walked to the bridge to oversee the final docking sequence, her steps light and her spirit soaring. Sovan was already there, his 4 eyes fixed on the orbital elevators. He looked at her and gave a slow, rhythmic blink, a gesture that had become their shared language of mutual respect. He remarked that the galaxy was starting to feel very small. Aris laughed, the sound warm and full of life. She told him that the galaxy wasn't getting smaller, their family was just getting bigger. With a final look at the stars, she gave the order to descend, ready to share the stories of the deep listen with a world that was finally ready to hear them. The return to Oakhaven from the Vale of Tears was not the end of a voyage, but the commencement of a new galactic epoch. Aris stood upon the highest balcony of the luminescent spire, the structure that now served as the physical and symbolic heart of the expanded coalition. Below her, the engineered forests of the capital world pulsed with a new vitality, their leaves shimmering with the bioluminescent hues gifted by the weavers and the deep, steady resonance of the liths. The air was a vibrant tapestry of scents, jasmine, ozone, and the ancient, cold smell of deep space minerals, all mingling in a harmony that seemed to vibrate within the very molecules of the planet. Beside her stood Sovan, his obsidian skin now etched with permanent lines of soft, golden light, a biological adaptation from his time spent within the Weaver hybrid environments. He looked out at the horizon, where 3 orbital elevators descended like pillars of spun diamond, carrying delegations from 42 different star systems. He remarked that in all the long histories recorded by his people, there had never been a moment where so many disparate threads of life had been woven into a single, unbreakable fabric. Humanity had not just survived the silence of the stars, they had colonized it with kindness. The humanity fuck yeah sentiment, once a defiant shout against a cold universe, had matured into a quiet, unwavering certainty that every living thing was a neighbor. Aris turned her gaze toward the central plaza, where a group of human children was showing a lith envy, a smaller mobile crystalline shard, how to manipulate the density of a local water feature to create floating sculptures. There was no fear, no hesitation, and no sense of other. To these children, a being made of ancient rock and gravity was as natural a part of their world as the trees and the sky. This was the ultimate victory of the human spirit, the normalization of the extraordinary. They had taken the terrifying vastness of the cosmos and turned it into a shared backyard. The final phase of the Great Conciliation was the activation of the universal mesh. This was a project of such immense scale that it had required the combined resources of every coalition world and the unique physics of both the weavers and the liths. It was a network of light and resonance that would allow for instantaneous, empathetic communication across the entire known galaxy. It would ensure that no species, no matter how remote or how different, would ever again have to wonder if they were alone. Marin, the chief engineer, had spent the last year living aboard a station at the galactic core, overseeing the placement of the final anchor. She sent a message to Aris that morning, her voice filled with a weary but triumphant peace, stating that the universe was finally ready to wake up. Aris walked into the activation chamber, a room that seemed to exist outside of standard dimensions. The walls were made of the same solidified light as the Weaver spire, but they were infused with the crystalline memory of the liths. In the center of the room sat a simple, rounded console of recycled earth steel, a humble reminder of where the journey had begun. Sovan and a Weaver representative, whose glow was now a steady, contented emerald, took their places beside her. They didn't need to speak. The connection between them was now as natural as breathing. Aris placed her hand upon the steel console, feeling the cold, familiar texture of the metal. She thought about the billions of humans who had lived and died on a single blue planet, never knowing that their stubborn capacity for hope would one day provide the heartbeat for an entire galaxy. She whispered a silent thank you to the ancestors who had looked at the stars and decided to keep shouting. With a gentle, firm pressure, Aris activated the mesh. For a moment, there was absolute stillness. Then, a wave of warmth washed over the room, followed by a surge of sensory data that was not overwhelming, but profoundly comforting. She felt the steady, slow pulse of the liths in the Vale of Tears. She felt the vibrant, rhythmic joy of the weavers in their peach-colored nebula. She felt the curious, flickering intelligence of a dozen new species just now emerging into the light. The galaxy was no longer a collection of points on a map. It was a single, living entity, a chorus of voices singing in 1,000 different tongues, but with a single, harmonious intent. The great silence was not just broken, it was permanently healed. Outside, the sky over Oakhaven transformed. The atmosphere began to shimmer with a soft, iridescent glow as the mesh synchronized with the planet's own energy field. People across the city stopped what they were doing and looked up, their faces illuminated by the light of 100 worlds. There were no shouts or cheers, only a profound, collective sigh of relief. They were all home, and home was everywhere. Sovereign reached out and placed his hand over Aris's on the console, his 4 eyes bright with unshed tears. He admitted that he had once thought the human obsession with connection was a weakness, a vulnerability that would lead to their extinction. But he now realized it was their greatest armor. By refusing to have enemies, they had made the universe their ally. The following weeks were a blur of peaceful integration. New gates were opened, new friendships were forged, and the very concept of alien began to fade from the common vocabulary. The amicable horizon was retired to a place of honor in the Orbital Museum, its silver hull a testament to the first brave steps into the dark. Aris, however, did not retire. She took a position as the Dean of the New Horizon Academy, a school where children from every corner of the mesh came to learn the arts of diplomatic resonance and empathetic engineering. She spent her days walking through the gardens of Oakhaven, followed by a trail of students who looked like light, rock, water, and shadow. She taught them that the most important tool they would ever possess was not a warp drive or a laser, but an open hand. On the anniversary of the first Weaver contact, Aris returned to the balcony of the luminescent spire. The trinary suns were setting, casting a long, golden glow over the forest. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the 2 crystals, the amber Weaver gift and the clear lith shard. She held them up to the light, watching as they vibrated in perfect synchronicity with the mesh. She felt a presence beside her and turned to see Soren, the botanist, who was now tending to a grove of trees that grew crystalline leaves. He looked at her and smiled, noting that the jasmine in the air had never smelled quite this sweet. Aris agreed, feeling the warmth of the setting suns on her face. She realized that the human story had reached its most beautiful chapter, the one where everyone stayed. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, they were joined by the artificial lights of the mesh, creating a new constellations of friendship. The galaxy was a vibrant, busy, and endlessly fascinating place, filled with mysteries that would take eons to solve. But for the first time in the history of life, those mysteries were being faced together. The humanity fuck yeah spirit had accomplished its ultimate goal. It had made itself unnecessary by making its values universal. They were no longer the exceptional ones, they were simply a part of the whole, a single voice in a magnificent, unending symphony. Aris leaned against the railing, her heart full and her mind at peace. She looked out at the lights of the city and the lights of the stars, and she knew that the future was not something to be feared. It was a gift that they had all earned. The final message Aris sent into the mesh was not a report or a directive. It was a simple sequence of coordinates and a single word that translated across every biological and mechanical language in the galaxy. It was an invitation to a festival on the shores of Oakhaven's Great Sea, a celebration of the simple fact of existence. As the message rippled through the stars, she felt the immediate, joyous response from a million different hearts. The galaxy was answering, and the answer was a resounding, beautiful yes. Aris closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the feeling of a universe that was finally, completely, and irrevocably awake. The stellar conciliation was complete, and the long, bright afternoon of the galaxy had only just begun. Sovan joined her at the railing, his presence a steady, comforting weight. He didn't need to say anything. The shared silence between them was the most eloquent conversation they had ever had. They stood together as the moons rose, two different beings from two different worlds, looking out at a universe that belonged to everyone. The dark was gone, replaced by a light that would never go out as long as there was someone to hold the lantern. Humanity had found its place among the stars, and it turned out that place was right in the center of the circle, holding everyone's hands. Aris took a deep breath of the jasmine-scented air and smiled. The journey was over, and the adventure was just beginning.